A $500 fine for a flower bed. But the HOA president didn't know who he was dealing with. The sun dipped low over the quiet neighborhood of Sycamore Grove, casting long golden rays over manicured lawns and picket fences. At the end of Oakleaf Drive stood a two-story brick home, its porch wrapped in freshly painted white railings, its yard trimmed to perfection. William Preston leaned against that very railing, holding a crisp white letter between his fingers. The ink was still drying on the official notice, a $500 fine for what the Homeowners Association claimed was an unauthorized flower bed. William's steel-gray eyes drifted over his front lawn. The flower bed in question was immaculate. Roses, daisies, and lavender bloomed in vibrant colors, meticulously arranged. They were his late wife's favorite. She had planted the first rose bush years ago, and he had kept it going ever since. Every petal carried a memory. And now, apparently, a fine. He glanced up the street where a stocky figure strutted along the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Clark Mendel, the HOA president. Khaki shorts, a salmon-colored polo stretched tight across his belly, and mirrored sunglasses perched on his sun-reddened nose. He was a man who relished authority in its pettiest form, enforcing HOA regulations with the zeal of a dictator. He issued fines like a sheriff handing out tickets, convinced his rule was absolute. Clark stopped to jot something down on his clipboard before turning toward William's house with a self-satisfied grin. It was the kind of grin that said he believed he had one. What he didn't realize was that he had just picked a fight with a man who spent his career dismantling cases of corruption. A man who sat on the bench of the state Supreme Court. William stepped off his porch, the fine still in hand. Calm. Controlled. "Morning," William called, approaching the sidewalk where Clark lingered beside his golf cart. Clark didn't bother to look up. "Something I can help you with, Mr. Preston?" William held up the notice between two fingers. "Mind explaining what this is about?" Clark's lips twitched. Unauthorized flower beds. Page 12 of the HOA guidelines. Any landscaping modification requires board approval. William raised a brow. "Flower beds require approval now? Since when?" "Since always," Clark replied without hesitation, tapping his clipboard as though it were gospel. "Standard policy. We have to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. You should have read the rules before you moved in." "I did," William said smoothly. "And nowhere does it say flower beds require prior approval." Clark chuckled. "You a lawyer or something?" William allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Something like that." Clark's grin widened, clearly mistaking William's restraint for weakness. "Rules are rules. You can pay the fine or file an appeal. But I wouldn't waste your time. I never lose." William met his gaze without flinching. "Is that so?" "It is," Clark said, puffing out his chest. William nodded thoughtfully, folding the notice and sliding it into his back pocket. "Good to know." That evening, William poured himself a glass of bourbon and settled into his leather chair in the study. He spread the HOA bylaws across his desk, documents he had requested and printed before he even bought the house. His instincts had been right. There was no clause requiring approval for flower beds. In fact, there were several discrepancies throughout the document. The deeper he dug, the clearer the pattern became. Rules were enforced inconsistently. His roses were a problem, but Clark's overgrown hedges weren't. A neighbor had been fined for a flagpole being too tall, yet another resident had an army of plastic flamingos without consequence. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. William leaned back in his chair, a slow thrill building inside him. It had been years since he had felt the tug of a genuine challenge. He wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. He was dealing with a bully. And William Preston did not lose to bullies. By morning, William was on Clark Mendel's doorstep. He sipped from a tall coffee tumbler as he glanced around, noting the numerous violations visible from the sidewalk alone. Overgrown hedges, faded paint on the garage, an oil stain in the driveway. Clark was halfway into his golf cart when William approached. "Morning," William said casually, lifting his coffee. "Thought I'd take your advice. Gave the rulebook a thorough read last night." Clark scowled. "Something I can help you with?" "Well," William said, pulling out his phone and tapping the screen. "Your hedges are about 18 inches too high, according to Section 3.5. Your mailbox isn't regulation height, and the driveway's oil stain should have warranted a fine weeks ago." Clark stiffened. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," William said smoothly. "Just making an observation." For the first time, Clark's smug grin faltered. "You don't want to start a war you can't win," Clark warned. William took a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, Clark. You have no idea who you're dealing with." By noon, a violation notice had been taped to Clark's front door. This time, the fine came from his own HOA board, prompted by William's formal complaint. He watched from his office window as Clark tore the notice down, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. The subtle pushback had landed, but William was just getting started. That evening, William attended his first HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was filled with neighbors, some indifferent, some anxious. Clark sat at the front, flanked by 3 board members who nodded along like puppets. Clark slammed his gavel onto the table with unnecessary force. Next on the agenda, violation dispute. Mr. Preston, you're here to contest your fine. William rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. I am. Clark's grin returned, oily and condescending. Just to be clear, this isn't a court of law, Judge. Different rules here. William's mouth twitched. I'm aware, but rules still matter. According to the HOA bylaws, there is no mention of flower beds requiring prior approval. Clark flipped open a folder. Page 12. All exterior modifications require prior approval. William stepped closer. That refers to major structural changes, fences, sheds, patios. A flower bed is not a structure. Agree to disagree, Clark said smugly. But the fine stands. William chuckled. You're free to disagree. The law, however, is not. A murmur spread through the crowd. A woman from the back spoke up. He's right. I've lived here for 10 years and never needed permission for a flower bed. Others nodded. Clark's expression soured. He tapped his gavel again. This isn't up for debate. The fine remains. But William could see the cracks forming. Clark's empire was built on arbitrary enforcement and intimidation. Unfortunately for him, William Preston was not one to be intimidated. Over the next few days, William documented everything. He photographed Clark's numerous violations. He spoke with neighbors who had been fined unfairly. A pattern emerged. Newcomers and dissenters were targeted, while Clark's friends and long-term allies were left alone. William compiled testimonies and evidence. The scope of Clark's abuse of power was staggering. Then William took his findings to the HOA's compliance officer, a man named Mark Deacon, who clearly despised working under Clark. Begrudgingly, Mark began issuing fines against Clark himself. By the afternoon, Clark had racked up over $750 in violations. That evening, Clark stomped up William's driveway, waving the notices in his fist. You think this is funny? He hissed. William set down his bourbon. Not at all. Rules are rules. You're making a mistake. William tilted his head. Because I'm following the rules? I run this HOA, Clark seethed. If you keep pushing, I'll make your life miserable. William smiled slowly. You already have. And that was your mistake. The next morning, William found 6 new violation notices taped to his door. A non-regulation bird feeder. An incorrectly painted mailbox. Window trim the wrong shade of white. The accusations were absurd, some even laughable. But Clark had gone nuclear. And desperation made people careless. William opened his laptop and pulled up the HOA's financial records. As a Supreme Court judge, he had seen his share of corruption. This smelled like it. HOA fines were supposed to cover community maintenance. But Sycamore Grove's roads were cracked, its pool had been closed for repairs for months, and the clubhouse was falling apart. Where was the money going? It didn't take William long to find the answer. Over 40% of the fines collected were unaccounted for, tens of thousands of dollars missing. Bingo. That afternoon, William casually strolled the neighborhood. He listened to stories. An elderly couple fined $1,200 for their garage door color. A single mother charged $500 for a security camera identical to dozens of others. A veteran nearly bankrupted over yard debris. William documented it all. Then he called an old contact, Dan Matthews, an investigative journalist. Mendel. Dan raised an eyebrow. I remember that name. He was caught embezzling from another HOA years ago. Settled quietly. Perfect. The next day, William filed formal requests for financial transparency. When Clark refused, William smiled and waited. 2 nights later, Clark snuck onto William's driveway and spray-painted fake cracks, then issued another fine for it. Unfortunately for Clark, William had cameras. High-resolution footage captured everything. At the next HOA meeting, William arrived with a thick folder of evidence. The room was packed. Clark tried to maintain control. We're here to address concerns about fines. William stood. No, Clark. We're here to address you. Clark's jaw clenched. You don't have the floor. I do now, William said, opening the folder. Over 40% of collected HOA fines are missing. You've ignored your own violations for years. And you vandalized my property to justify another fine. Gasps rippled through the crowd. William held up photos of Clark spray painting his driveway. Clark turned white as a sheet. Without a word, he bolted from the meeting. But it was too late. The next morning, William received a foreclosure notice, Clark's last desperate move. But William was ready. By noon, he had filed a lawsuit against Clark personally for fraud and defamation and a second against the HOA for mismanagement and homeowners' rights violations. Then he made a phone call. State Attorney's Office? I have a case you'll want to hear. That evening, Clark came storming onto William's porch. You think you're smart? He spat. You think you can challenge me? William sipped his bourbon. This was never your neighborhood, Clark. You're going to lose. I'm a Supreme Court judge, William said calmly. You really should have done your homework. He tossed Clark a folder. 2 lawsuits. And the state attorney is investigating your embezzlement. Clark stood there, frozen, as William added, resign now, or this gets worse. By morning, Clark Mindle had resigned. By evening, he was removed from the HOA. But William wasn't finished. Within weeks, the state attorney's investigation confirmed everything. Clark had embezzled hundreds of thousands. His home, car, and accounts were seized for restitution. At the next community meeting, 2 officers arrested Clark for fraud, financial misconduct, and vandalism. He was handcuffed in front of the homeowners he had once bullied. William raised his glass in silent victory. In the weeks that followed, the HOA dissolved. Homeowners formed a simple council to handle actual community needs, no fines, no harassment. William worked tirelessly to ensure refunds were issued to every wronged homeowner. Some received hundreds. Others got back thousands. Clark's assets paid much of the restitution. His ill-gotten wealth returned to those he had exploited. Months later, William sat on his porch, bourbon in hand, watching his restored flower bed sway in the breeze. No more fines. No more threats. Then his phone buzzed. A message from Dan Matthews. Mindle took a plea. 3 years. William smiled. Peace, it seemed, wasn't boring after all. And somewhere in the distance, the next neighborhood was calling. But that was a story for another day. End.